Thank
My name is Jim Coddington. I am a retired conservator, but I was a paintings conservator for 30 years at the Museum of Modern Art and for a number of years prior to that at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Yeah, I can. And it's kind of a stupid story because it's somewhat unbelievable, but I swear it's true. In that I am the perfect poster child for a liberal arts education. Um, I went to undergrad intending to major in biology, but I did choose a college read that puts an emphasis on the humanities, and that's one of the reasons why I did choose it. That I would uh, get an exposure to a broader education than just the major I was going to be choosing. Uh, and I took an art history course, got interested, and got increasingly interested as I moved along in my undergraduate years. But by the time I decided I did not want to be a biologist, I was too far along. I I was about ready to start my thesis, and I didn't want to switch majors. Couldn't do that. But I continued to take art history, and um, one day in my senior year, it was in a northern Baroque course. Um, Before the class, I heard the professor uh, talking to one of the other students about something, and I listened in, and he was talking about the National Gallery cleaning controversy, a rather famous event in the history of conservation back in the 1940s, 50s, around the National Gallery of London and the cleaning of paintings there, whether they were overcleaned, what was the appropriate aesthetic for that a conservator would bring to such a question. And I swear, a light bulb went on in my head, and I said, that sounds like some science. That also sounds like some art history. I think that might be a comfortable zone for me. And I was really fortunate. The two professors that taught art history at Reed at that time, we're talking about the early, mid 1970s here, they both knew a lot about conservation. They were connoisseurs, pretty unusual in that academic setting. And one was a connoisseur of Constable. Peter, the one who I overheard talking, was a uh, uh, print connoisseur, Old Master Prints. Later became Old Master Print curator at the National Gallery. This is a long answer, but they were both very instrumental in help me push me along and giving me guidance as I, you know, tried to get all of the tried to get into the field of conservation.
Nice.
Hmm. I hope you get to edit this.
Yes. Yep, I can edit out any
Yeah,
awkward
yeah,
moments or
yeah,
pauses. No, but that's so great. That's similar to how I became
yeah.
interested in it a little
Uh-huh.
bit. I
Yeah,
It's like, oh, that my only skill is art. That's the only thing I know how to do, but I'm
yeah,
gonna be a starving artist. And one of my
yeah,
professors was like, ah, look into conservation. You might like
yeah,
it.
yeah. And I mean, so I didn't have any art background when I decided to go into it. So that was an academic deficiency that I had to make up. I had to take uh, uh, studio art courses. Yeah.
Mm. So, after if you sort of became interested in conservation at the end of undergrad, how did you then go on to pursue it after undergraduate? Did you do a pre-program, um, or just go directly into grad school?
We're talking a long time ago. We're talking almost 50 years ago. It was a somewhat different landscape then,
Hmm.
but not entirely different. It was not different in that there were the three programs here in this
Yeah.
country, same three programs that there are now. But the competitiveness and you cite a pre-program
Hmm.
as a path that didn't exist then. What did exist is what still exists, and what I think the vast majority follow is you You graduate, you make up the difference between what you got as an undergraduate and what you need to get a full application into one of the graduate schools, and you get some practical experience. I did um, all of those things in varying measures. Uh, what I did do was I went to the University of Delaware in art history. After a few years out of Reed, taking the studio art courses, having a great time living in Portland, Oregon, um, I decided, okay, I will go to Delaware in art history with the very specific idea of just, making myself present around the conservation program. Um, and after 1 year in the graduate art history program, I was accepted into uh, the conservation program. So um,
Great.
I still have a little work to do to get my master's in art history.
Um, Great. Yeah, if we want to dive into a little bit of what kind of work you did as a paintings conservator,
Mhm.
would you like to sort of? I know it's hard to describe like a typical day, um,
I,
but
it is hard, but it's something that I've tried to do. What you might almost call an ekphrasis of a treatment. Just
Mhm,
like art historians or you know people have tried to write about, well, what is their reaction to a painting. Um, I will say that a typical day, at the easel in front of a painting is pretty prosaic. Um, you one of the things you kind of circle whatever problem it is that you have. You have certain tools, certain procedures that you've become familiar with that you're probably going to test out. So let's just say I've got to consolidate some paint, and I I look at what's probably happening. This is a podcast. I can't see my hands here, but the paint is probably lifting away from the canvas. It
mhm,
has lost its adhesion to the canvas. This is not surprising. The materials that make up a painting, it's an unnatural state of affairs. Oil or acrylic and collagen and canvas. You know, artists put them together. Nature didn't. So it's an unnatural state of affairs. So the likelihood that it will come apart, you know, uh,
mhm,
it shouldn't be surprising. But anyway, I'm confronted by paint that is coming loose. I have to decide, what adhesive will I use? One of the first things I learned in conservation was um, uh, how to use rabbit skin glue, and or any sort of animal glue. You mix it up in water. You put some the glue in, dissolve it, and then so that's done by formula. But you then dip your forefinger, your middle finger in to get a little bit of it, and sort of tap it on your uh, thumb, and as it dries, you get a feel for how strong it is, whether that's the right strength for this.
mhm,
And so you continue to adjust your mixture until, it feels just right on your thumb. Now, I can tell you a lot of science behind, what's going on there, but what's really going on is I'm just practicing my craft. And, so this is what I mean by circling the problem. I'm beginning to feel how this, is it strong enough? But also, is it, what viscosity is it? Because I've got to get it in under the paint. And then I
mhm,
have to figure out, do I apply a little bit of heat to it? And I'm making certain choices. I might then say, no, I don't want to use that one because I'm going to have to use too much heat to put the paint down to adhere it to this adhesive that I've just put in. So I'll go to a different adhesive that I'm familiar with. So that is the kind of thing that you are doing throughout the hours of the day in front of the easel, circling a problem, testing out, all the different tools in your kits, the pulling arrows out of your quiver to see if they are the right one for it. And by right, I mean feels right to me as a craftsman, doing the job, but that, I can manipulate everything in a way that allows my hands to really speak to the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. I mean,
Yeah, it's we tend to dress ourselves up as scientists, and it drives me crazy because science is about repeatability. Every
mhm,
restoration is unique. Yeah, it's really so much more about craft. Yeah,
mhm, yeah. The science is helpful, but it's
yeah.
useless without the craft.
It's one of the tools. It's not the end itself. No.
Hmm. Let's see. Uh, yeah, I wanted to ask. I mentioned in my email that I'm thinking about sort of preservation versus restoration in
Hmm. Hmm.
conservation.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've talked to a lot of different people who have different opinions. Some are very much in the preventive conservation is the way to go, always, whenever you can.
Hmm.
I've spoken to people who are like, that's leading to conservators, younger conservators aren't getting experience with hands-on paintings. They're not learning
Yeah.
enough anymore. Yeah, I wanted to see if you had any thoughts to weigh in on that. If you have any ethical mottos or like that guide you when you're doing the restoration, if it's very one on case by
Yeah.
case basis.
Yeah. Um, so uh, I am a huge proponent of preventative conservation. Um, but my reasoning for that might be a little um, different from what some of the others you've spoken to might say. And the reason I say that is that a work of art is never more exposed to danger than when it is being restored. Um, it's being handled. Things can go wrong, but also somebody can just do it poorly. And there's no going back from that. That is, and one had a choice at that point. When the normal aging process takes place, we don't have much of a choice about that. We can slow it down a little bit, but that's just the nature of the world, and art lives in the world just like we do. So, the idea of preventive conservation, slowing the aging process down, or minimize for me minimizing the taking the work of art out of the restoration cycle for as long as possible is very much one of the goals of preventive conservation for me. That concern that if preventive conservation is all one does, and then one is confronted with the necessity of putting your hands on a picture and you haven't, or whatever work of art, and you haven't had a lot of training, yeah, that's the most dangerous. That's sort of like my worry, exponentially.
Mhm.
So there's a little bit of a conundrum there, but I don't think that there is. I think anybody who has done serious hands-on restoration is going to recognize, uh, and the argument I'm making here, and that
Yeah.
they are going to say, yeah, take it out of the restoration cycle for as long as you can. That said. Um, there are limits as to how much preventive conservation can do. If you're talking about temperature and humidity, and you're talking about, let's say, a collection like the Museum of Modern Art, you have so many different optimal set points for all of the different materials. So you're going to be making a lot of serious compromises in the preventive conservation steps that you take there. You can take a lot of preventive conservation steps in terms of safe handling and so on, because those can be customized and optimized to whatever objects you're talking about. I don't think I came up with a definitive answer for you there, but I don't think there is one. Yeah,
Yeah, no,
yeah,
that's good.
yeah,
Um, yeah, sorry, I was just going pulling
yeah.
up the questions. Yeah, I would love to hear about more about how you collaborated with other uh, artists, or I guess anyone who was involved in the uh, uh, restoration conservation
Yeah,
process.
yeah,
Who did you collaborate with? What was the
yeah. So working at the Museum of Modern Art in conservation, uh, you know, one does a lot of collaborating, and that's
Mhm.
because the damn artists just don't respect the boundaries of the materials. They experiment. And that's one of the great things about working there.
Mhm.
So, the mixing of the different media and the different expertise that a sculpture conservator, a photo conservator, paintings conservator bring, you'll find these you a use for this expertise in you know uh, multiple places across a single work of art potentially. And so one is collaborating with one's colleagues, whether it's just asking them a question about, well, I've got this material on the work I'm working on, what do you suggest, to actually designing and executing an entire treatment in tandem. These are all possibilities with a collection as diverse materially as the Museum of Modern Arts. Um, Other collaborations, one of, again, at MoMA, we we do have anybody working at a modern museum, contemporary museum, uh, has the luxury or the opportunity, I would say, of talking to artists and asking them, specific questions about what they were trying to do, what materials they used, and so on. Uh, on some of these questions, artists are sort of your classic unreliable narrator. They don't necessarily remember what they used, or they change their mind and say, well, this is what it should look like now. And that's where a great sort of uh, philosophical problem will arise for one. Uh, this work was, painted in 1974. You're restoring it in 1993, and the artist says, "Well, it should look like this now." Um, and you say, "But it's 1973." That's then where you can bring a curator in and collaborate with the curator and ask the curator what their thinking is from a broader art historical perspective. I would, myself, almost always lean towards, it's made in 1974. Let's see, let's not doll it up and make it look like something that is now approaching the 21st century. That
Yeah.
is to some extent falsifying the record rather than preserving it. But it's not without its. Sorry, let me give you what is kind of a good example of this for me, and directly from my experience.
Oh, please do. That was going to be my next question
Okay.
anyway.
Um, uh, the artist Tom Wesselman has multiple works in MoMA's collection, but there was one particular work that he had. I believe, I think it's called Still Life number something. I forget what, but the construction of the piece is it's on a board. There is like some tin ceiling material stapled to it. There is a super mini kind of refrigerator on the surface. Basically, he constructs a scene of a very domestic kitchen from,
Mhm.
it looks like the 1960s. This was when the work was done. And he's painted a table, and then on the table he has cut out things from various magazines, a cereal box, a piece of roast beef, fruit, and so on. And these are all cut out and pasted onto this painted table, into this domestic still life scene. Um,
Sounds like a very cool piece, but it also
it,
sounds like
it
it was
is.
designed to be hard to conserve. You
Yeah.
have tin roofs and
Yeah.
paper
Yeah.
and
Right. And, part of the problem is, well, fundamental to this is that, some of these materials are rock solid stable. They looked exactly the same when I approach this for well. What happened then was sometime in the sort of late '90s, Wesselman wrote to the chief curator at MoMA of Painting and Sculpture and said, um, the collage pieces here, the things that he cut out from the magazines, have faded. Well, this is not surprising. They're on crummy paper. They weren't meant to last. And he says, they faded. I would like to come in and rub some color on them to bring them back up in brightness, or bring the color back up. And Kirk sort of passed this off to me. What do you think? And I said, I don't like that idea. First, there is this principle of reversibility. I'm sure you've heard of it in
Yeah.
your queries here. And having him put something directly onto the original work itself is going to be pretty unreversible. So I don't like that. So we, said, thanks, but no thanks. We'll leave the work the way it is. And some number of years later, he came back and said, okay, this is still bothering me. And I've got a new way of approaching this. And what Wesselman had done was he had documented, photographed everything as it left his studio. So just like a conservator, final photograph at the end of a treatment. You take these photographs before, during, and after treatment to document the state. He has pretty much the definitive photographic record of it when it was finished. And what he was doing then was he was working with a conservator with these original photographs, taking the areas of any piece that had faded, and he was speaking very specifically about one where a strawberry milkshake, was now clearly a vanilla milkshake. It had nothing to do with strawberries. So that's a huge change in a painting. Balance, everything is just very, very different. And what he was doing with the conservator was blowing these the sections of these slides up, and then cutting, printing them, and getting to exactly the right size of the collage element that had faded, and putting an isolating layer in between, and then placing the new one, which has the correct colors and so on, exactly in place. And the very cool thing about this process was that the printing process that was used in the 1960s, the Ben-Day dots, is of course preserved because he has documented that in the slide that he took when it left his studio. So, these, look very much for all the world like a cutout from a 1960s magazine. So formally, a lot of the questions are still my reservations from before are answered here, but there is still something that doesn't feel right to me. Do we get to renew a piece all of the time? All of the time. And this is where very often we go to the artist and say, what's your opinion? Well, Wesselman has made his opinion crystal clear to us. Yes, he wants this to look fresh and new, like he had just made it. But in conversation with curators, I say, but he didn't just make it, did he? This is not what a work from the 1960s looks like. And, for me, where I eventually came down on this was we didn't do anything about it. What we did do was we did a digital version of it. We pasted it in digitally so that you can see what it, really did, get a strong sense. It's not a substitute for the original, for all the reasons we know, but you get a strong sense of what it did once look like. But that for me, Wesselman is a pop artist. Well, popular culture. It is evanescent. It comes and it goes. And that, for me, is very much encapsulated in these faded pieces. It is still, in that sense, very much an authentic work of art.
Yeah.
Wesselman would not be happy with it, but I think from a historical perspective, from a history of art perspective, from a material perspective, from a conservation perspective, something, a real truth has been preserved by leaving it in the state that it's in. As sad as that state might be to some, it still remains, authentic to me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I read a great article a couple of years ago called "Crimes Against the Cubists about that.
Ah, okay. But keep going, Isabella. I have a lot to say on this, but you start the conversation.
Oh, well, yeah, I didn't realize you'd have a lot to say. I didn't know it was such an infamous. No, I was doing some research onto just learning a little bit about ethical issues and like considerations in conservation and especially conservation of modern art.
Yeah.
And I stumbled across that essay, which I thought was very interesting and well written, and particularly interesting because it was then followed up in my copy of it by about six responses, and then
Hmm.
responses to those responses getting
Yeah.
increasingly angrier.
Yeah. It was a salient moment in our field, um, uh, and I'm sorry that it hasn't gotten additional responses over the decades. But
Hmm.
what Richardson says in that article is very much true.
Yeah.
The treatments that these works suffered, as he outlines it, are just serious depredations of these works
Mhm.
of art. Um, and unfortunately, the defense of those treatments that Mrs. Keck gave, and she was a leading light in our field, established, trained a lot of people. Um, her response was just like, God, how many softballs can I throw to Richardson? In his response to me, she just, missed uh, the point of
Mhm.
Richardson's article. Um, and, you know, Richardson's article kicked off. eh, it arrived at a moment when some of these lining treatments were very much under um, uh, serious reconsideration in our field.
Mhm.
A decade or so before, there had been a very, very important meeting, reconsidering the whole idea of lining and even calling for a moratorium on lining. When Richardson's article landed, it kind of just really put an exclamation point at the end of that discussion, and lining really came to a halt.
Mhm.
Of course, people had to do some lining; it's necessary in some cases, but the fear of doing something terribly wrong just took hold, and and I think generally for the good. It made us think a little more about, well, can we just keep consolidating and so on, rather than lining it to give it the support that would prevent this in the first place. And
Mhm.
that's an example of where treatment is regarded as preventive conservation.
Yeah.
You see, that's a rather larger intervention than just controlling your environment or putting a handling frame on
Mhm.
on a painting. But there, I can understand the thinking of a conservator in the 1950s or 60s, when there were three or four conservators in New York City who spent time even thinking about modern art.
Yeah.
So if they were confronted with a deteriorating painting in that environment, nobody was going to look at that again for another 40 years. So you had to do something that would last a pretty long time, and that might well
Mhm.
mean you had to line it. So I understand where they were coming from. Unfortunately, there's they might have looked for a better solution than what they got. Anyway,
Yeah.
um, so this kind of uh, w- people backing away from lining gets us to one of the points you made very much earlier on about up and coming conservators not getting exposure to certain treatment practices. And
Mhm.
lining is like most um, uh, sort of discrete one that we can point to. That the idea of how to line a painting and the sort of embodied memory is no longer passed down from generation
Yeah.
to generation. It's kind of skipped a generation. That is being resolved. We did a big conference, and then at Yale in 2019, and last year published a book on, and it was one of the uh, editors of that book um, that sort of revisits the question of lining. Where are we now, and what might we consider best practices for lining
Yeah.
now? Yeah. But Richardson, I have, I've got some reservations about Richardson's methodology there, and it was put very nicely to me by one of the curators at MoMA, who said, Richardson, and he quotes Bill Rubin, who was chief curator at MoMA at the time, who washed his hands of the whole episode. That's a whole separate issue, and I won't get into that one with you. But this curator said to me, Richardson, says, Picasso, dites-moi, Picasso says to me, such and such, such and such. Well, this is an unverifiable
Yeah.
fact. And so, you know, I'd like to have a little more substance to such a very important argument in our field than Picasso said to me or Brock said to me. And I would like it to get down to these pictures don't look good. They've lost something. Well, let's talk about what it is they've lost and what it is, can we get some of that back, or where do we go to find what that original or as close to the original aged look is? Because the um, uh, a cubist painting, and particularly one with collage elements on it, presents another sort of wonderful thought experiment for me. We've got a piece of Le Journal, on a Picasso from 1916 or whatever, choose a year, and let us just say I found in a drawer, sandwiched between some, in a book, a perfectly preserved piece of that paper, and it looks exactly the way it did the day Picasso stuck it on there. Well, you know, um, back to kind of the Wesselman argument, the case would be this is, if I put that on there, the oil paint has not changed all that much. It's this piece of newsprint that has darkened and is way different looking from what it was originally. Why shouldn't I put this new one on there? He didn't paint it. It has none of the artist's signature hand or, touch, anything like that. It's just a piece of paper that he chose for a particular look and, for a particular aesthetic. I can restore that aesthetic far better. But we would never do that. We would never, ever do that. And for me, the question is, why wouldn't we? And that takes me to an essay that maybe or maybe not you've read, but if you haven't, please do. Alois Riegel's on the culture of monuments. He writes this in the 1930s, I believe, and it is still a very lucid account of how we assign value to works of art and how that might have an impact on how we receive them as a society. But I can also read into it how we receive them in terms of our potential treatment options.
Yeah, I'll definitely check that out.
Yeah.
My professors tend to steer us away from things written before like the 50s, so. But
wow. Geez.
not okay, that's an exaggeration. I mean, like in terms of essays and stuff, if I pull an article from like the 30s, they'll be like, don't use that, that's too old.
All right. Well, bring me,
You disagree?
yeah, I profoundly disagree. Um, I find, this would be one of the best examples
Mhm.
I can find. Um, and if I'm looking at a Renaissance painting, why should I not ask Vasari, who saw them, what he
Mhm.
saw? It's crazy not to, um,
No,
because
I'll definitely check that
yeah,
article out.
yeah. I do because it's not been surpassed since. It's a wonderful summation. People have tried to write books, and Regal gets it in a single essay. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Let's see. Um, oh, yeah, switching back a little bit to away from theory and into a more
Okay. Yeah.
practical sense. So I know you started off as a scientist in undergrad.
Hmm.
Did you do a lot of scientific conservation work, scientific analysis, chemistry, conservation chemistry, or did you find yourself really stepping away from the science and more into the artistry, the like painting, etc.?
So I regard conservation as actually an extension of art history.
Hmm.
It's I loved art history because it brought me to objects, um, and uh, and so how much closer to an object could I be than in the conservation studio? But it just felt like and I still
Hmm.
believe to be an extension of art history that um, our arguments are aesthetic ones.
Yeah.
They are ones that a historical mindset has to take account of. I have to be able to take account of my presentist
Hmm.
biases. Um, and so, how can I do that from a scientist's perspective? I'm putting my hands on a painting, and I'm changing it by what lights? By what is my bias here? It's I am changing this work, and it's a historical enterprise that I'm engaged in. That
Hmm.
said, and like we've said before, science can help me understand some of those questions about how I might change it. But uh, you know, I did do a fair amount of scientific research, both on paintings, but more around larger questions of paintings. Extended amount of work with some scientists at Rochester Institute of Technology to develop a simple, straightforward, usable camera, not unlike one that you would buy off the shelf with minor modifications, to document the actual colors of a work of art. Um,
That
and
is such a good idea.
yeah,
It's
I mean, one can do it. You can,
Mhm.
get spectrometric data, but it's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you're going to need to have a scientist to run the machine. How
Mhm.
can we do this with a machine that we're all familiar with, and that we can use in our day-to-day practice? And why is that important? Well, you clearly get it.
Yeah.
What did it look like in this year? What did it look like in that year? And you know, uh, how can I make it look more like what it originally did?
Mhm.
You can't make it look like it originally did. Nothing can be, but you can at least enter into an informed debate of how yellow was that yellow,
Yeah.
and then carry on from there. So that's an example of where science could really yield a tool that would yield information that
Mhm.
would be um, you know just you know obviously helpful in resolving some of the softer debates. I'm all for the soft argument.
Yeah.
That's what it is in the end. But let's keep as much extraneous material out of that argument as we can.
Great.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I know we've been talking for a while and I don't want to keep you, so I think I've just got two final
Sure.
questions.
Yeah.
The first one being, do you have any words of advice or suggestions to aspiring art conservators?
Yeah. More than a few words. But uh, um, don't give up. It's a hard road to hoe.
Mhm.
It is. And there's kind of like a catch-22 here, and that is you're going to need to get conservation experience to get into conservation school, and that's what you need to do to get into the field of conservation
Yeah.
school. And how are you going to get conservation experience if you've never had conservation experience? Who's going to give you that first shot?
I'm not
And
going to
that's
be
what you have
gonna
to
deal with
not
that.
give up on. Just knock on doors, figuratively and literally, to get that. Whatever academic work you need to fill in the gaps. That's obviously available to anybody. It's that hands-on conservation experience,
Yeah.
and it's not just it's for you and your CV to get into conservation school, but it's also for you to find out, is this really what I want to do? Does this truly speak to me? And if it doesn't, great, you found that out. You didn't kid yourself about it. So that's really what getting the conservation experience is about. Finding out whether this is
Before you
you.
commit
If it
3
is,
to 4 years of your
yeah,
life to
yeah,
school for it.
yeah. And if it is, I can tell you, it's the greatest profession in the world. It is rewarding beyond words. Yeah,
That's amazing. Well, I'm
yeah,
so happy for you that you
yeah.
figured out it's what you wanted to do.
Yeah. Very, 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 very fortunate. But I somehow or other, I just think that liberal arts education had plowed the field, fertilized
Mhm.
the field, and it was just waiting for that one seed to drop in there, and it did. Yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah.
And then my final question should be a pretty easy answer.
Mhm.
What is your favorite piece of artwork? It's your favorite painting.
Ah, oh well, I'll actually give you two answers, and I'm going to assume that you want me to answer from MoMA's collection. There are,
Whatever you.
well, I'll do that
Mhm.
because uh, you know, pretty much almost any painting by Mark Rothko, I would love
I
to
really do
sit
love
in front
Morocco.
of, every day. There's one in particular, number 10, by Rothko. I forget what year. Um, it's a large blue field, yellow field, and some white. And for me, I mean, it's aesthetically beautiful. And when I first saw it, it just felt like I was looking at a Renaissance painting as well. It had that kind of um, uh, purity and excitement of discovery that characterizes Renaissance painting too. Another work in the museum's collection is actually a sculpture, and it's of a bunch of found objects. I forget the date exactly. It's probably around the 1920s, but it's by a Russian artist, Baronov Rossinet. And it's, these found objects, talk about things that have aged and so on. Well, they were old when he put them together. It has an abjectness about it, and it's put together like a figure, it's a figurative sculpture. But the colors, it's, it is just quietly beautiful in its presence. And it was rarely on view during my years at MoMA, but since the last reinstallation, it's been on view almost all the time, and it's really wonderful.
Lovely. I'll absolutely go check that out.
Yeah, yeah,
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me
yeah,
today.
yeah.
I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay, and as you pursue um, conservation. Um, uh, you know, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch.
Thank you so
Thank you so
much.
much.